Greetings and salutations. For me, it is late in the evening, and the beauty about this online world is that we can time travel. And so I am going to be joined, by the way, I should introduce myself, Shana. I'm Dr. Claire Nelson. I'm a member of the executive board of the World Future Studies Federation and editor of Human Futures. And it's really a delight to participate in this way and meet so many new people in the process of hosting this online session. So I'm very excited to spend the rest of my night. I normally spend witching hour with people all the way in Australia, especially because I plan to visit there one day. And we'll be joined by Kimberly Camrass. And her first session, this 20-minute session, will talk about regenerative urban futures, creating a narrative of hope and empowerment. And that is music to my ears. So Kimberly, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. I'm just going to share my screen so people can see my presentation. Hopefully that's working. Could I just get some feedback on whether that presentation is being shared?
Yes, it's being shared.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, thank you for that lovely introduction, Claire. So today we'll be looking at both prevailing sustainable development approaches and regenerative approaches, particularly in the urban built environment. But we'll also be considering in this short talk how futures thinking could further inform those regenerative approaches and additionally help to provide a hopeful narrative to engage and inspire communities. So I think it's quite clear that we're standing at an environmental precipice currently, and the anthropogenic climate change is not only an ecological crisis, but it's posing a range of social, economic and cultural threats as well. So whilst the urgency of the issue is clear and the emotional reactions the issue can spark are valid, this can lead to a sense of overwhelm, of fear and paralysis. And that's really the very antithesis of what many who are trying to shape a genuinely sustainable future are trying to achieve. So the question for this session is, how do we ensure the urgency to act is communicated, but in a way that's accessible, hopeful, inclusive and empowering? So I'll just flick over to my next slide. Sorry, I'm just having a slight issue with my PowerPoint here. Great. Okay, so let's take a bit of a step back first and look at the problem. So rapidly growing urban centres present a particular challenge when we're looking at climate change, because whilst they only occupy about 3% of the planet's land area, actually account for about 70% of global emissions. And buildings themselves within these cities account for about 40% of the world's energy use. So it's clear that we need to look at this linear, almost unchecked growth and mitigate further harm. And that's precisely what sustainable development approaches have tried to do, focusing on mitigating that environmental harm to prevent further degradation. And we see this happening through reduced resource consumption, increased energy efficiency, and the minimisation of impact. And that's great, of course it is, and really necessary. But the question is, when we're telling the story and the narrative, should harm mitigation be the ultimate aspirational objective? And more importantly, can our behaviour continue to occur within a more reductionist paradigm that separates and prioritises human objectives from those of the natural world of which we're part? So there's no doubt that frameworks that recognise this interdependence of humans and facilitate progression towards positive collective goals are required. So what do we mean by regenerative approaches, and could these be a way to frame this action? So regenerative approaches, in particular the fields of regenerative building design and regenerative development, aim to do just that, to move from a continuum of sustainable or less bad to a process whereby which humans are participating in a co-evolution of the social and natural systems of which we're part. We'll touch a little bit more on the features of these fields shortly, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this graph. This is a figure from regenerative practitioner Bill Reed, and it beautifully plots that progression from conventional through green, sustainable, and up to regenerative practice. And of course, this isn't to say that actions at a sustainable or green level are not important. Of course they are. but it's really about extending our ideas about how what ultimate aspirations could look like, and particularly important when we work with communities to envision desired futures. So, whilst regenerative philosophies have undoubtedly been around throughout history, um, regenerative frameworks within this urban built environment context really started to re-emerge in the mid-1990s, and this was primarily as a result of ecological approaches to building design. This table provides a bit of a high-level summary of what we're talking about when we're looking at regenerative design and development in the built environment. And I'll just like to draw your attention to a couple of key features of these practices. The first is that action really starts with development of a story of place. So what is the story across temporal scales of a particular place, and how does that help us to set goals for what building social and natural capital actually looks like, and also to help us understand what achieving a pattern relationship between human and natural systems looks like in that particular place. So this practice really focuses on impact rather than output, and the collaborative development of both actions, but also measures of success as well. So I guess my key question today is it within this regenerative paradigm that we can really help to create hopeful narratives of the future? And how can futures thinking help us to embrace both the unknown and the knowable, as described in this beautiful quote? How can it help us to tell a story or a narrative that is empowering? And particularly, how can it provide the tools to actually engage communities? So for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to explore this crossover between futures thinking and regenerative approaches, and the implications this has for the language we use and the narratives we tell about change and transformation. Okay, so this will be a framework that's obviously going to be familiar to most people watching and listening. Obviously, causal layered analysis by Suhail Inayatullah is a extremely useful framework to look at a problem, an issue, an object, a place in a layered way, and really helps us to go beyond the litany or the obvious and look at the systems, the worldviews, the myths and the metaphors that underpin certain issues. And this has been a really useful framework for me to use to look at both prevailing sustainable development approaches and regenerative approaches in a deeper, more authentic way, and to really help to unpack what are the implications for thinking and practice when we're looking at urban regenerative futures, and what does that mean for the stories that we tell? Can CLA help us to facilitate the development of a layered, deep, authentic, but also empowering narrative around a regenerative future in our cities? Okay, so let's dive into the CLA layers first. So as many of you would know, the first layer of CLA is litany, and it's at this layer that we're looking at quantitative trends, issues, and data. So it's here that we're looking at some of those largely unquestioned assumptions, and in the context of urban sustainability, analysis at this level really illustrates the quantitative reality of our current challenges. And when we think about that from the perspective of traditional sustainable development approaches, we're often looking here at maintaining an optimum bottom line state as an aspirational objective. We could also be thinking about the imposition of technical solutions on communities, and the use of indicator-based assessments to really judge the extent to which a project produces fewer negative impacts. So, you know, this is in contrast really to litany at a regenerative level, which is where we really seek to move beyond harm minimisation as the aspirational objective. And as I mentioned earlier, of course, these interventions continue to be required, but we also need to think about how we can extend that aspiration to really consider where can we create net positive environmental and social outcomes, and what role does the built environment have in creating those sort of places. So, you know, buildings themselves, it could be argued, can actually become filters, cleaners and providers rather than simply inert agents or objects of environmental degradation. But that requires us to look at them in a different way. And I think really key here is that at a linearly level, regenerative design and development approaches really call for us to incorporate a range of data and knowledge sources that are perhaps less typical. So not just reliant on quantitative data and expert knowledge, for example. Okay, moving on to our next slide here. Obviously, the next layer of CLA is systems, and it's here that we really consider the social, political, and historical factors that have led to a particular problem. So in the context of sustainability, many of the approaches that we see at a systems level include the development and delivery of strategic plans and policies, even the use of aggregation methods and measurement tools, for example, to assess outcomes. And these have all been really important steps to further the sustainability of our cities. But often we see this introduced or delivered in a more of a top-down approach that is, yes, aiming to minimise environmental harm and create socially cohesive communities, but can sometimes fail to adequately adjust and cater for the specific and regional needs of those communities, and to get those communities' insights into the co-design of those strategies. So I think also at a systems level, we see that some approaches to the built environment in a traditional sustainable development sense tend to limit the boundaries of a project quite narrowly, often to the physical boundaries of a particular building. So how do we broaden that out at a systems level? So regenerative design and development really help us to do that by looking at the underlying causes of urban problems from a systems perspective, particularly through the development of a story of place. So as I mentioned earlier, that story becomes the means by which we first understand place, and in a way that's done throughout time. So not just present focus, but also incorporative of historical factors as well, and of the factors of landscape as well as human participants in the community. So in this way, at a systems level, the data sources and the ways of working that we integrate in regenerative practice are generally a lot broader, and really looking at unveiling those patterns that are present historically, presently, geographically, socially, and economically. So I think it's really important, though, when we think about regenerative practice at a systems level, is we also need to consider the fact that what net positive or what regenerative means is up for debate. So how do we make sure that what we're defining as net positive in a certain situation is not having unintended consequences when we're looking at the system more broadly? I think it's interesting to think about regenerative approaches at a systems level in terms of not only how we think about them, but also how we feel about them. So, and obviously that involves an examination of the worldviews that are framing our actions. So when we look at worldviews and we really use CLA as a framework to analyse sustainable development and regenerative approaches, we really need to think about some of the foundation worldviews that have helped develop those fields. So sustainable development approaches traditionally have really been underpinned by a more reductionist or mechanistic worldview that separates the various sustainability challenges to the sum of their parts. So this can support the compartmentalisation of sustainability issues and potentially the positioning of humans as apart from or above nature. So often you will see this manifesting in urban centres in a more positivist approach to planning or design that really emphasises known outcomes and can perhaps unintentionally perpetuate sort of city-nature dualism as well. Having said that, it's not a good versus bad approach here. Of course, we need to appreciate the benefits that the reductionist worldview has had in our understanding of cities, in our development of the scientific method, in our understanding of biological processes, for example. But we really also need to realise that in the complex urban systems we are currently living and working in, a reductionist worldview and the subsequent compartmentalisation of policy and programs may not be helping us work towards the most hopeful, empowering and regenerative outcomes for the future. So when we look at regenerative approaches, alternatively, it's actually requiring us to have a fundamental shift in our mindset to actually realise the potential for us as humans to act as embedded actors within interconnected social and natural systems. So in that way, regenerative approaches are supported by an ecological worldview. So it's interesting to think about what the metaphor of or the image of a spider's web helps us to draw from when we think about that ecological worldview, thinking about our behaviour and actions as humans as interconnected and potentially both negatively or positively contributing to the ongoing properties of nature. So it really not only requires us to think about our approach to sustainability in cities, but also the role of cities more broadly and our position within them. So as you can see here, we can see a few images that kind of illustrate these worldviews and help us to use language or tell a story in a way that supports these. So the clock can represent many of the features at a litany and systems level that inform these dominant approaches to sustainability. Alternatively, the web may help us to communicate the central metaphor of a regenerative system, of a living system of which humans are a part. Brings us to the final layer of our CLA, our brief CLA this morning, that when we think about what a regenerative future and how we could communicate a regenerative future for urban centres using metaphor might mean, other metaphors can emerge. We have a beating heart, the lungs of a city here. But these all have an underlying theme, that they're including aspects of connection and growth. And I think what's really important when we think about creating that hopeful, empowering narrative around climate change, it's important that the communities themselves are participants in this process, that they're identifying these images for themselves and using them as metaphors, not only to encapsulate their place, but also the ongoing process of social learning and growth and hopefully regeneration that they're undertaking. Indeed, I think that's another really important point. Regeneration as a process is iterative, and that has implications for the language that we use to talk about working towards the future. It also means we need to incorporate imaginative and visual elements as well. And I think that is a really important implication. It can't be achieved in urban settings just simply through the manufacturing or the engineering of sanitized versions of biodiversity. Much like the building and the maintenance of the web image we saw earlier, regeneration in cities and the stories we tell about it need to be continuous and adaptive to change. But regenerative practice acknowledges the fact that we're entangled within these complex systems or webs. And I think the key message there is that we need to move beyond compartmentalization and to really embrace human capital, including things like flexibility, bravery, and a sense of deep listening to open ourselves up to new possibilities. This is a brief summary of what we've discussed this morning in terms of the causal layered analysis across both of these approaches to sustainability. And there will be times where those dominant sustainability paradigms are so useful in terms of looking at things in discrete projects or places. But really, when we come to engage communities and cities in particular in working towards a regenerative future, it's going to require us to really unpack some of the underpinning assumptions we have about our role as humans within these broader ecological or living systems, and requires us to both act but also communicate in a way that is incorporative of the whole, not just of our discrete roles. So when we think about a story of place and a starting point for visioning of our desired future, CLA can obviously really help with this as well. So it's a practical tool that can be used in regenerative practice to help communities really unpack and deepen their stories of place and to incorporate both historical, cultural, and even spiritual elements in addition to the ecological and social elements as well. So I think when we sum it up and we think about, goodness, our time is nearly up. When we think about what this all means, for returning to a narrative of hope, essentially it's through those layers of the CLA, those considerations of place, but also regenerative practice from a world and myth metaphor level, that we can really help communities to reflect upon, to unpack, and to vision what their own concepts of regeneration and success look like. So when we think about the pressing environmental challenges we currently face, we really need to tell a narrative that inspires action and helps to overcome those feelings of overwhelm we've touched on earlier. And the significant challenge for regenerative fields is, how do we do this? How do we engage communities on an ongoing basis in this process of social learning? I think the utilisation of visual, narrative, and metaphorical representations are extremely helpful and important in this process, and a really wonderful example of how future studies and thinking can help to add to and inform regenerative practice. So in summing up, I'd just like to say, I think it's the examination of the metaphors that underpin our thinking and behaviour in urban settings that will really be able to unpick those assumptions and collectively develop hopeful narratives and actions towards a more regenerative future. And I'll now stop sharing. Thank you very much. Oh, Claire, you're on mute, sorry.
Thank you so much again, Kimberly Camrass. And we have a couple of people on. Are there any questions? Any questions? We see a couple of people on. I guess not. Everybody's so quiet today. No comments. Let me see if anything in the chat. No, nothing in the chat. All right. Well, then, Kimberly, you are recording. What I would like you to ask you to do is, if you could just stop the recording for us. Thank you so much again for being here.